So just stick with me. If you have additions, let me know. And for everyone here, this is from 30,000 feet, okay? We are going to spend a single week on the construction of the Bible. You can take class after class about this topic. So just know, I am flying over a lot of detail. So if there are things that you want to know more about, come ask me. I might not have the answer, but I can figure it out for you. And if I make a mistake, let me know and we will go back over it. This is also a temporary setup. We could not get the overhead projector and screen to communicate with each other. So hopefully by next week, this will be gone. But Eric has very clear instructions at 10:40, even if I am still talking, this thing is going away. So it doesn't show up on our broadcast. I'm also going to have to stand kind of here in the middle to click through this. So we're going to start with some Bible trivia, because I just want a sense of what you know and what you don't know. And I know that's a little hard to see. I apologize. I can turn them off. Can somebody turn them off completely for me? That would be great. Yeah, the board is straight up. Yeah. Yeah, not ideal. Is that a little better?
That's a little better.
Okay.
Can't see the little word.
So here's the first question. How many books are in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament? 66. Good. I heard Craig first. What is the original language of the Old Testament? Hebrew. Good. And the New Testament? Good. These are the easy ones. True or false? The Hebrew Bible, Catholic Bible, Orthodox Bibles, and Protestant Bibles, the order in which the books appear are a little bit different. That is true. Those are all slightly different. Okay, we get a little harder. Whoops, well, I gave away the answer. Okay, this Old Testament man undergoes a name change, tells people his wife is his sister, and almost sacrifices his son. Good. I mean, I gave you that one, but I think you knew it. This Old Testament book is composed of songs and poetry. Right? You guys are flying through these. This Old Testament woman suffers many years of infertility. Before being given a son, she promises to God's service. Hannah. I know there are several that have infertility issues. I was thinking specifically of Hannah. All right, these are a little bit harder. I think you can do it. How many humans are on the ark?
8.
Say it again, Peggy.
8.
Humans. So remember, Noah had 3 sons, they had wives, and Noah and his wife. Okay? Which Babylonian emperor allowed the Israelites to return to the Holy Land? Say it again, Craig. Good. Did you learn that in VBS too? Okay. He's ruining the curve, isn't he? And almost. Who requested the head of John the Baptist? Salome. Yep, that's right. Salome, Salome. Just depends on how you pronounce it. Okay. So let's talk specifically about the Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament. All right? Again, you probably know most of this. There are several sections to it. The first is the Torah, which means teaching. This is also called the Pentateuch, or the 5 books of Moses, Penta for 5. Tradition holds that Moses wrote those books. Historically, whether or not that's accurate is up for some debate, but that's the tradition behind the Pentateuch. Right, how he could write it after he died, we don't know, but that's the historical lesson there. And there I have them listed for you. The next section is the Nevi'im. Nevi'im. Learn a little Hebrew today. That's prophets. Nevi''im is the transliteration, Nevi'im. And there are a couple of sections to this. The former prophets and the latter prophets. This has nothing to do with their importance. This is just about where they fall, okay? So don't think one is more important than the other. That wording can be a little confusing. That's not what it means.
Aren't they called the lesser prophets sometimes?
Lesser, yes, lesser as in the books aren't as long. Yeah, the books aren't as long is really the biggest piece of that. Not that they're less important. And I think sometimes they're treated like they're less important, but I think Torah scholars would tell us not less important. All right, the next section is the... Oh, am I in your way? I'm sorry. All right, I apologize. Okay, next section is the Ketuvim, and this is the writings. There are a couple of different ways to organize this. I even went back to my Old Testament textbook to try to figure out how that textbook organized it, and it didn't even have a clear list. So there might be some disagreement here, but they're in the Ketuvim, which is kind of the catch-all for everything else in the Old Testament, is poetry, which Psalms and Proverbs, the 5 scrolls, Song of Songs or Solomon, same thing, Ruth, Esther, Lamentations, and Ecclesiastes. And then short story literature, Job. Job can be classified a couple of different ways. This is one way. Prophecy or apocalyptic literature, that's the book of Daniel. If you've never read the book of Daniel, it's a wild ride. You should read it. And then history, which is Ezra, Nehemiah, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Okay? So you can see there, that's a lot of different books. They don't necessarily go in those other sections, and so they kind of end up in this section. You with me so far? Yes. I can. Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot of information coming at you. Okay, so that's all I'm doing about the Old Testament. Do we have anything else we want to say, questions we want to ask? Like I said, 30,000 feet.
How did they decide the order, and how did they decide what was included?
You're reading ahead to next week. No, that's okay. It's a great question. We're going to talk about that next week. The really simple, basic answer is it took a very long time, and it involved a lot of people and a lot of opinions. So, especially the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, took a much longer time. You know, the New Testament is just newer, right? It wasn't written as long ago. There is a rich history of oral tradition in the Hebrew Bible, in Jewish tradition, and we have some of that too, but not at all to the same extent. So, yeah, the really simple answer is it took a long time. The oldest part of the Old Testament? We don't know for sure. I believe Job is the oldest book in the Old Testament. I don't know the exact year. Does anybody else have an idea? Bob, do you know? Yeah, I think Job is potentially the oldest. It's certainly the oldest in this particular section. No, I don't know. Potentially. And again, it's hard to have a specific number, right? Because how do you track oral tradition? So I can look and find you a ballpark, but I don't want to give you a number and have it be wrong.
800 is close enough.
Okay.
I've slept since then.
All right, let's go to the New Testament. I know that's impossible to see from where you are, so I will share this. But that is the composition of the New Testament, and that timeline starts at the year 20 and goes to the year 150. So in that span of time, we get the entirety of the New Testament, okay? That might seem like a long time. It really isn't, especially in comparison to the Old Testament. So all of these books that we have as the New Testament came about relatively quickly. You'll also, if you can see it, that very first date there, right before the year 30, is the death of Jesus, okay? And I want you to notice how much space there is between the death of Jesus and when the first book, and you probably can't read it, 1 Thessalonians was written, which was right around year 50. So just think about the idea that there was a solid 50 years in there before anything was actually written down in a way that is measurable. Now, were things written before then? Yeah, probably. Do we have the scrolls and the things to prove it? No. So that's the other thing to keep in mind is it's not that it didn't exist, it's that we don't necessarily have a record that we can look back and that is reliable. Y'all with me? Does that make sense so far? Okay. So we're going to talk about the Gospels first, not because they were written first, but because they are first in our Bibles. First of all, who knows what gospel means? Good. Gospel means good news. The first one written, even though it is not the first, was the Gospel of Mark. Okay? It was written around the year 70, approximately. Everything here is approximate, all right? Keep that in mind. Then Matthew, around 80. John in 90, and then Luke, which was originally was one book with the book of Acts, one very long book, was around the year 110. So, looking at this, what do you notice? What stands out?
They lived a long time.
Well, either they lived a really long time or, correct, they were not eyewitnesses to Jesus. Okay? Now, these are names of disciples. So, how does that work? Did they live forever like Abraham and, or Moses and right after Moses' death? Or are we using some names of recognizable disciples when we're putting this down and recording it? Do you notice anything else about this? Between 50 and 60, yep. Mm-hmm. Right. The other thing is, and I talked about this when we started this series we're doing on the book of Matthew, all four of these stories, or these versions, tell the same basic story, right? These are all versions of Jesus' life. There are a couple of different reasons for that. We'll get into more of that next week when we talk about how the Bible came into being. Part of it is these Gospels were all popular and being read in different geographical areas. And they're all a little bit different because they were tailored to the specific audience they were written for, okay? So when the Bible was put together, there were other Gospels. These four, for lots of reasons, were the four that were chosen to put in the canon, okay? The other thing is, and I've said this to you before, the best explanation I have heard about why we have multiple Gospels is four people witness a car wreck. They are all going to notice different things about that car wreck. Now, arguably, these are not eyewitnesses, right? But they are getting different strands, different eyewitness testimonies, and they're putting those into their Gospels. They share some of the same information. They share foundational information. Matthew and Luke, in particular, are very similar. Mark does his own thing. John is the weirdo in the corner. John is not like anybody else. John is the weirdest gospel. And I say weirdo in the corner. That's how my New Testament professor explained it. He said, you have all the other Gospels here, and then John is the one in the corner building a bomb. And we don't know why, but John's over there. So, these are all folks coming at the same story in a very different way, which for us, I think, enriches our picture of Jesus. I think for some folks that might be confusing. Okay, these are four different stories about the same thing. Right, but these were not written to be history, okay? These were not written to tell a historical narrative. These were not written to be scientific texts. These were not written to be political argument. All four of these books were written to evangelize, to tell people about Jesus, and to maybe have them come join this new movement. So what we think of as dating and scientific fact, that was not what this was concerned with, okay? So try to remove that from your thinking as you think about this. Okay, so from here, we go to historical narrative. The only book in the New Testament that falls into that is the book of Acts. And like I said, it was originally one book with the book of Luke, so quite long. Everything else in the New Testament is an epistle, a letter. Now, you can argue that the letters take very different formats, and some of them do. The book of Revelation is quite different. But everything else is basically a letter. It is advice, it's instruction, it's admonition, it's correction from someone to someone else about how to live a life of faith. A lot of these are attributed to Paul, but historical record says probably didn't write the majority of the ones he's credited with. He certainly didn't write all of them. And I should have come up with that number, and I apologize I didn't. Thank you. He wrote 7, thank you. Anita knows. So he wrote 7. He did not write all of these. And we don't know for sure who wrote the rest. People have thoughts. Conjecture has been made, but we don't know for sure. Looking at this, talking about this so far, do you have questions? Do you have thoughts? Anything bubbling up for you?
I've read that there was a gospel of Mary Magdalene was discovered not in its entirety, but I do have a book that admittedly I have not finished reading on that.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about like why that was?
Why they didn't find the whole thing, or why it wasn't included?
All of it.
I don't know much about that particular book. I remember hearing about that. Why they didn't find the whole thing, because it's very, very old, and those sorts of things get lost. Why it wasn't included? I think the PC answer is probably it wasn't in wide enough circulation. It didn't fit with the orthodoxy of the church, because there was a very orthodox view of things that some books didn't fit into. We also don't have a lot of books in the Bible that are about women. So, whether or not that had something to do with it, we have no way of knowing. I don't think it's a bad idea to keep that in mind. There's no real way to know. What does the book said? Do you remember?
So far, all I've read is that they have discovered very much of it.
Okay.
The idea presented in the book is that it wasn't deliberately, it was not, they didn't want to include it because of issues that Cedar had with her relationship with Jesus.
Oh, okay.
Which it does, in the Bible, it does say things that would suggest that he did have issues.
Potentially, right. Will we ever know for sure? No. And those sorts of things, people did. Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. They didn't.
I was trying not to say that, but yeah.
Mary.
It was Mary. And Mary's gotten a very bad reputation that is completely undeserved. I'll preach a sermon on that someday. All right. Any other thoughts, questions? Because I really only have one more slide, and then we're going to have some discussion, because I wanted to make sure we ended on time. Yeah,
Are you going to include anything about the Apocrypha?
next week.
Okay.
Next week. Yep. Baby steps. Yeah, I wanted us to start real slow, but y'all are further ahead than I thought you were. So. No? Okay.
I grew up in the church, but I know very little about the Bible.
Good. Well, thank you for admitting that. I appreciate it. A lot of this I would not have learned if I didn't go into seminary. So, other questions? Even if you think it's a dumb question, it is not. That's what this is for. Be bold and ask it. Anything?
Are there parts that are generally less acceptable?
Flesh that out more for me.
I'm thinking about don't eat shrimp, don't have clothes with more than one fiber, Leviticus.
What do you mean less acceptable?
Well, so they're kind of taken with a grain of salt, and we kind of are not, we're ignoring them more today.
Are there parts, are you thinking of the New Testament or Old Testament?
Even in Old Testament.
Are there parts of the Old Testament we don't give as much attention to? Is that your
Like
question?
Revelations and the animals with the
To an extent, I don't have necessarily a great sense about that.
Rats.
My gut reaction is it depends on the church, depends on your tradition, depends on your pastor. I think there are some Christian churches that spend most of their time in the Gospels, in part because it's comfortable. There are folks who consider themselves red letter Christians, right? Just the words of Jesus, which is okay, but in my view, a little short-sighted.
When you said that they were composed for that specific audience in that context,
Right.
that leaves us available to interpret how it relates to us.
Yes, it does. But like the Gospel of Matthew, let's say, right? Because that's what we're focusing on in worship. It was written for a very specific group of believers who were trying to navigate what it meant to have been Jewish, to be this new thing, and to be in conflict with the synagogue. And in some ways, Matthew is the most Jewish gospel, and it's also arguable it's the most anti-Semitic gospel. And a lot of it is because of that tension that's happening between this new group of believers figuring out what the heck they are, a good majority of whom had Jewish roots, if not all of them, but not being part of the synagogue anymore. And the other thing you have to remember, especially with Matthew, is this is after the temple's been destroyed. So even Jewish folks have to re-find an identity because you can't go to the temple anymore. So how can you be Jewish without a temple? So there's a lot of identity finding. And Bob and I were talking about this week. We have this idea in our head, and I'm guilty of it, that Jewish people are our ancestors in faith. And they are to an extent. But what I'm learning as I'm reading and educating myself better is Judaism has not always been this monolith that we think of it as now. In the Old Testament, part of what the Jewish community was struggling with, the Israelites, was that they weren't always monotheistic. They didn't always just worship one God. They struggled with these what we would call pagan influences. They had times when it wasn't just Yahweh that they recognized. And then these prophets would come in and say, wait a minute, come back over here. That's not what we're doing. And just as Christianity had to come into being to be what we know it to be today, so did Judaism. And it didn't happen all at once. So keep that in mind too, is that just like Christianity had to develop, right, become orthodox, meaning a set of beliefs that are very clear, Judaism did too. And it was stops and starts, it was bits and pieces, it didn't all happen at once. And that is happening at the same time that all of these holy books are being put together, okay? So this is the written down part, but as we know, church is not just the written down part. It's also the very human part that goes along with it. So that influences all of this too. Yes, sir?
Well, you talked earlier about how the different gospels were written to talk to different communities. I was just curious about Jews who became Christians and non-Jews who became Christians, if there was conflict between those groups.
Oh, yeah.
To what extent those conflicts vary from region to region, or percentages of the Jews or versus the Gentiles?
Yeah, I don't know the actual percentages. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Just have it later in the
Okay, I'll work on it for next week. Was there conflict? There absolutely was. There absolutely was. Yes, and you see a lot of that in the book of Acts. So I have read through the book of Acts with a rabbi. It was wildly uncomfortable because there's so much anti-Jewishness in the book of Acts. So to answer your question was there conflict? Lots of it. It was an ongoing issue. And that's why even later, as you get into Paul's writing, there's that whole argument about circumcision. Do you have to be circumcised to follow Christ? That's case in point right there. This is an ongoing issue of what do we do with this Judaism thing that a lot of us started in. Jesus was a Jew. All of his followers were Jews. We aren't necessarily anymore, but what are we? Right? Because that Christian, that word came later. I think the original terminology, once it developed, was they were followers of the way, was what I've read. Even that didn't happen right away. So, lots and lots of conflict. Other questions?
What's the best Bible to read?
We're going to get into that in a few weeks. I can give you my personal opinions about ones I don't think you should read. I will tell you the easy answer to that right now, because that's in a couple of weeks. The academic standard is the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version. If you go to seminary, well, let me put this caveat on it. If you go to a moderate or progressive seminary, the academic standard is NRSV. I don't know what the conservative seminaries do. I didn't go to one of those. They wouldn't have let me. So that is the academic standard. The New Oxford Annotated is very good. Yeah. My recommendation for young readers, like teenagers transitioning from a children's Bible, and I'll say all this to you again, is the Message. Now, is it an exact translation? No, it's a paraphrase. But it's readable. And if what we're trying to do is get people to read the text, I think it's a good place to start. Now, I also think you need another Bible to go along with it, right? Don't let that be your only one. But for teenagers, I have found that's a good place to start, and it's less intimidating. Because picking up the King James and trying to get a 14-year-old, even the best reader in the world, unless they really love poetry, it doesn't work. Yet at the same time, let's not lose the King James, because it's beautiful. And the language in there is so special. Other questions? Okay, I know this is impossible to see, but these are the three different canons. I did not include the Orthodox canon because there just wasn't room. But on the far left is the Hebrew Bible and its canon. In the middle is the Catholic Bible and its canon. On the far right is the Protestant Old Testament, okay? What's really interesting, and you'll see this when I send you these slides, our Catholic brothers and sisters use a lot of books we don't use, okay? And maybe JJ can tell us more about that, I don't know. But who asked me about the Apocrypha? Kyle, was that you? Yeah. So you can't see it, but on the very far right, down at the bottom, this is our Protestant Old Testament. That's what we use. There's a section called the Apocrypha. We'll talk about this more next week. But the Apocrypha, for Protestants in particular, is a group of books that we don't use in worship, hardly ever. They're in some Bibles. You have to buy a Bible with an Apocrypha in it. Yeah, because that's a nice Bible, so it'll be in that one. Basic Bibles, you're not going to get it. So if you're curious about reading the Apocrypha, you have to look for one that has it in there. They usually put it, not always, but usually put it between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And these are books that, for whatever reason, didn't make it into the canon. That's the simplest explanation. Some of those are Tobit, the Gospel of Judith, some additions to Esther, the Wisdom of Solomon, the Prayer of Ezra, Susanna, Bel and the Dragon, which is the coolest name, and 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And there are a couple other ones in there too. They're worth a read. They really are. They're interesting. The Maccabees are really interesting. They were Jewish religious leaders. We don't use them in worship because through a process, specifically in the Protestant Reformation, they were seen not to be as authoritative as everything else. It's still there, and it's kind of like what you were talking about. Maybe they just didn't circulate as much. Maybe we don't have the whole text. Lots of different reasons. But that is for us, for Protestants, which if you didn't know, maybe with the exception of JJ, all of us in this room are Protestants, okay? If we're not Catholic, we're Protestants. So that's all of us here. Our Catholic brothers and sisters use more of those. And then the Hebrew Bible, a lot of those books, if they accept them, are considered deuterocanonical. They are an extra canon. They are an extra order of books. Y'all with me? Clear as mud? Deuterocanonical. So an extra canon. Okay? Yeah, and if you want advice about picking a Bible, hang in there, and we'll talk about that in a couple weeks. But for now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to find a partner, and I want you to try to find someone you don't know or don't know well. In here, do your best. I know that might be hard, so maybe not your sister. Just as a suggestion. And you can be in small groups, but I would like for you to get up and move around, maybe meet a new friend. 2 things. My favorite Bible story is, and a Bible story I do not like or do not understand is. Those are the 2 questions. You have got 8 minutes. Go.